Hello there and welcome. In this video we are going to demonstrate a new feature within DockShell called DockShell Localization. In DockShell Localization, as you can see by this diagram, has many moving parts, but ultimately at the end of the day the objective is to be able to support one or more cultures, and a culture obviously is a language definition for languages. So as we know in LightSwitch, you can set culture, a specific culture per application, and it's a design time thing. And what we're going to show is that we can overcome that design time limitation and actually change the culture dynamically. And how do we do that? Well, as we look at this diagram here, we can see that we have this outer border here, which represents our core LightSwitch application. And since we're leveraging the DockShell framework, we actually have the advantage of Prism. And in particular, this particular aspect of Prism is known as the Prism Module Manager that we'll be leveraging today. So essentially, what we're going to be doing is telling Prism about a couple of external modules that sit outside of the core application, so outside of the LightSwitch Zap application, which all LightSwitch applications for Silverlight ultimately compile into. And these Zap files here will actually be modules that will provide instruction on how to load the external resources. And then we have in this green area a new functional component called the DockShell Localization Manager. And that's part of the core framework. And basically what its role and responsibility is to accept instructions coming through this external feed, these external modules that will be loaded in, and to then on demand pull in these resources and blend those resources with the existing resources within the application itself. So that's the Localization Manager. Above that we have another new area, which is a DockShell Cultural Info View Model. And basically this view model here is holding some pretty lightweight objects that we're going to use for visual data binding, and we're going to build a drop-down list that allows the user to select which culture they want to advance to. And so basically this drop-down list is bound to each one of these iDockShell localization module instances that are hosted in a collection or observable collection within this view model. It is actually this module here, when it's requested to load, that actually creates one of these objects inside our DockShell Cultural Info View model. But let's start at the beginning. If we look at the beginning, basically what happens is at application startup, what we do is we actually create a DockShell Localization Manager within the LightSwitch application. We'll take you through that in a little bit to explain what we're doing there. But what we're also doing is we're defining Prism modules. So we're defining that there is this Prism module out here. It's a French Prism module or a Spanish language Prism module. And we do that at startup, and we basically push that into the Prism Module Manager. And then we can either initiate a command to request the Prism Module Manager to load this Prism module, which is an asynchronous event. It basically they're completely decoupled, and as it loads, it will basically call into this DockShell Localization Manager. Or, and what we're going to demonstrate today is that we'll basically load these when available, which basically says any dependencies that I have instructed associated to this module must first be resolved, and once they're resolved, then this module will automatically load in, or Prism Module Manager will attempt to load that in. The ZAP file could be located on a different server. In fact, more likely than not, it'll be located right beside this ZAP file. So when you deploy this ZAP file, these module ZAP file and resource ZAP files actually would be deployed beside to the same deployment location as this particular ZAP file. But they don't have to be. So you could basically deploy these anywhere in the world, for that matter, as long as the various configurations within that server allow for that ZAP file to be accessible outside the domain. You can put these ZAP files anywhere. But for our demonstration today, these will actually be hosted in the same deployment location. And then finally, we have our UI elements. So our UI elements are bound to this DockShell Localization Manager. And in reality, it's not actually this DockShell Localization Manager. There's actually a public resource file that's automatically loaded into your application when you start using resources within the modeling tool. And that resource file is actually, at startup, what we do is we take that resource file, and in particular the resource manager associated to that resource file, and we assign it to this DockShell Localization Manager. From that point forward, any changes to the UI, in other words, if I drop this list down and I change it from US English to French, this will cause a cultural change event within this particular manager, which all of the various DockShell V models are listening, that have UI elements associated, are listening to that change, and they in fact will cause a rebinding on the UI elements. So that's one way it's done. Some UI elements are bound directly to the resource file itself. So we'll take you through that as well. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell, what we're trying to achieve. And let's take a look at our project now. So this is a standard DockShell project where we have, in this case, just a single screen, customer list detail, and we have a single ribbon tab, task ribbons tab, which is basically set as a result of this LightSwitch navigation group. What we've also done is we've created a UI fragment, and that UI fragment is actually a simple combo box, a combo box drop down, and the purpose of that is to host our UI cultures, so that we'll be able to select the individual cultures and cause the UI to change. Let's take a look at the project layout for a second. And so we'll start with this Northwind project itself. So this is your LightSwitch project. And if we expand your client project for a second, we're not going to go into any details around DockShell and setting up DockShell within LightSwitch, because those videos, there's plenty of videos out there that explain how to do that. In this video, what we're going to do is just concentrate on this localization, this new localization aspect. So let's kind of minimize a few of these things so we have a better ability to explain. And we'll just, there we go. All right, so if we look here, we've created a solution folder called DockShell, and we typically do that just to keep things organized. And in there we have our model, which is this diagram that you're seeing here. And when you save this diagram, it automatically code generates out a T4 template, which is actually shown down here. What's new in this template from before is that we've added a few additional initialization base abstract classes called a base localization initialization class. It has a single method, which right now is called get resource manager, and right now returns null for a resource manager. And all the way to the bottom, down there, we'll actually see this DockShell Localization Manager. Now, so this is code generated for us, so we don't have to write any code for this. So basically, if you're not using localization, this will still be here, but because you don't implement this partial class for this localization initialization extension, this will simply return a null, and the resource manager will be set to null, and everything will be fine. However, if you are using localization, you're going to want to implement a partial class for this localization initialization extension. And we're going to take you through that in just a second. The other thing to sort of bear in mind here is that in the resources folder associated to your LightSwitch project, you'll notice here that we have this navigation layout resource resx file. And this file is actually automatically added anytime you add a resource within any of the UI elements in your model. So for example, if I was to go over to, say, this button, this DockShell command, which is, this is your screen navigation button, and I was to look at the properties for this, you're going to see some new properties associated to this particular command. In particular, if we look down here, we'll see these string resource properties. So we have display name, tooltip, and tooltip 2. We still hang on to the original display value. So this is basically, if you want to think about it, more of a hard-coded approach where we're setting the display name to customers. But in this case here, we're using a resource file. So if I was to select that, up would pop a resource editor. And so as you can see here, each one of these strings is actually associated to a resource element within your model. And so the idea is that you would go through and set up your resources through this technique where you would just basically pick for instance, this is the design or customization button. So here you can see we have the tooltip for that, and the tool display name set to design. So it's set to design, basically that's the English equivalent of it. So that's cool. And of course, in each of our separate projects here, we also have a French version of basically the same thing. So if I was to open this up and look at it from a Visual Studio editing perspective, you can see here that we've done some translation. Now, of course, this translation was done through Google Translation, so it may not be exactly what it should be for a French translation. And we've done the same thing on the Spanish side of things. So you can see that we've got our Spanish tooltips and our customers and so forth. Very cool. Just close that. All right, so so that covers off the model. And that covers off where this particular file comes from, which is, as I say, it originates from the fact as soon as you add one resource key into this model anywhere, it'll automatically add this, and that's what you're editing when you're editing that editor. You can also edit those resources, using a standard resource editor. So whatever makes it easier for you. All right, so. So as we pointed out, this file here code generates out this localization, and the starting point for us is basically we want to implement this localization initialization extension, and in particular we want to provide a get resource manager supporting method to return a resource manager for our localization manager. And the resource manager that we want to return is the resource manager associated to this particular resource file. And one thing I should point out here, it's very important, is that this resource file, when it's added, does not set this to public. And in fact, you need that to be set to public. And the reason that you need that to be set to public, so in other words, go and set it to public, is when it comes to the initialization itself. So if we look at our initialization, and here's that local initialization extension partial class being implemented here. You notice here that we're overriding the get resource manager, and we're returning the instance of this navigation layout resources file, which is this file that's down right here, and we're returning its resource manager. So that's basically how you then bring this resource file and assign it to our resource manager. So again, what we've done is we're setting this guy up here, and we're setting a resource manager, assigning a resource manager to him. That resource manager is actually coming from this file. All right. Okay, so the other part of the setup is this whole definition, setting up these modules, and that's pretty easy to do. Basically, if I open up this file here, and I'll just pin this back so we can see this a little better. So this is just another application initialization extension where we're overriding the extend module catalog. And what this does is that the DockShell framework will, at startup, will do a couple things. It will look for an external config file, which basically has the same kind of definition that we're going to go through here, so that you don't have to write a code adding a module by code like we're doing here. You could actually put it inside the config file. And I should say, not just we also reach out to the LightSwitch application and say, okay, what modules do you want to also include? And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to include this French language module. If we go back to our diagram, what we're looking at here is this piece right here. Now, for brevity's sake, we've eliminated this module here. We could have two modules, but we're just going to actually pull these two resources in through this single module. And let's take a look at how we do that. So first, let's take a look at the module. And Prism modules are really simple and quite nice, actually. The whole concept behind a Prism module is that you'll notice here that the only reference to the framework that we have inside this module is this single interface definition. So this gives us a really nice decoupled scenario here where we are very loosely coupled between the core application and this particular module. In a Prism module, the way you implement a Prism module, it's pretty simple. So you would put any other resources you would like to have in here, which in this case here is very limited, because what we're going to do in this Prism module, which is defined through this module export tag. This is a Prism export, not a MEF export. But you'll notice here that you just give it a string name. In this case, we're calling it French language. It really should be French-Spanish language module, because we're going to be loading up both the French and the Spanish language in this one call. You could actually have two Prism modules, like in the diagram, but we're just going to have one for now. And you'll notice here that we also can put depends on, so we can specify any modules that we have dependencies on that need to load in advance of this. So in this case here, we're saying the client module and the provider module. The provider module is that provider project that you have made available to you. And so basically, and the client module is the LightSwitch application. So that kind of makes sense that we want to see those two things before we allow this module to load. This interface here, this could be any interface you want. That just kind of gives it a nice, unique kind of representation. The definition of this, or the implementation of this, has nothing in it, so it's an empty implementation. And the name of the module just happens to be the same. It does, or sorry, the class, that it doesn't have to be the same as the module export tag. It could be different. But here's something that's pretty interesting here. This localization, DockShell Localization Manager. So what's really cool about this scenario here is that this is defined in the interface. And as you recall from our Solution Explorer here, if we look at our references, it is really the only, outside of Prism, the only, and MEF rather, the only reference that we have associated to our module. And in there, we're saying, hey, go get us an DockShell Localization Manager when you spin this up. So MEF is actually going to spin this up. Prism's Prism Module Manager starts the process of discovery, finding this ZAP file. And when it finds it, it downloads it. Then it asks MEF, it says, MEF, go ahead and spin up this thing called a French language module. And it'll do that. But before it does that, it says, hey, I noticed that you have a series of import attributes associated to this class. I'll go and resolve those, which in this case, MEF goes and looks for this thing called an DockShell Localization Manager. And hopefully you were paying attention, because if we go back to our startup here, that's actually this class right here. So this stuff, code that we've hardwired into this code-generated file is actually the DockShell Localization Manager. So there's the only instance, because its creation policy is shared. There's only one of these that gets created ever in the life cycle or lifetime of your application. And of course, this happens well before that Prism module loads, so therefore that resource manager will be assigned to that resx file that we looked at earlier. And so when this module eventually loads asynchronously and blends itself into, if you will, your existing LightSwitch application, this localization manager will be resolved by MEF. And therefore, once this module loads, Prism Module Manager will then call through this initialize and allow you to do whatever you like. And in this case, because this is a module, a language module, what we're basically a localization scenario, what we're doing is we're taking this localization manager and we're basically saying, hey, go ahead and load these resources file. So in this case here, we are looking for two. We're looking for a French resources file, and so we're establishing a culture of French, and the source URL. Now this could be anywhere in the world URL. It just so happens that we want it to be right beside the same ZAP file for the LightSwitch application. So we'll take a look at how that's deployed in a second. And then this is the display name. So this is what the combo box that we've added into the solution is going to bind to. And the same thing for our Spanish. But you'll notice here one difference here. On the Spanish, we're saying, hey, don't go and load it right away. So delay that load. In other words, just load the French first, but don't load the Spanish. And this here is just simply a simple class that represents this definition here. This will actually be externalized and then put inside the localization manager. Okay, so that's basically how we load up our external resources. So our external resources, we haven't looked at that just yet, but or we actually did, but only briefly. So if we look at our external resources, we actually have a navigation layout Spanish resx, and the translated text is in there. But we also add references here to all of the resources for the Spanish translation that are associated to a Spanish resources needs. So as you can see here, there's quite a few. And we do the same thing on the French. So the French references, which looks like, oops, wrong one, there we go. That was the Prism module. This is the actual resources file. You can see it's the same thing. We have all of these resources here. And the idea is that if we go back to our diagram, that so step one is we set the modules up. We tell Prism about them. And then step two, because this one, if we go back, we actually hadn't covered that yet, so I want to cover that first, just so that you see that. If we go back to our application initialization and pin this back, you'll notice here that what we're doing is we're adding this module. This is now a Prism module info to Prism Manager module. And we're basically saying to the module catalog that, hey, there's this thing out there called a French language module. It's located at this ZAP location, which this again could be anywhere in the world. But again, we're going to deploy that right beside our LightSwitch application. So we don't have any other path other than the name of the file itself. But you'll notice here that I can set the initialization mode, and I can change this to actually be, so instead of when available, I can actually change that to be on demand. And the difference between when available on demand is that when available says when all my dependencies have been satisfied, I will automatically load this module. I will go ahead and Prism Manager will Module Manager will go ahead and load that module. On demand basically says I'm going to wait for an event, either a user-initiated event or a system-related event, to instruct Module Manager to then go and load that file. So this is kind of nice if you want to load a bunch of resources like we're going to do now. We're going to load those resources in advance or just shortly after the application starts up. Asynchronously, we're going to run those, and I'm going to show you in Fiddler how that all happens. But when it's a demand, on demand, it would take some other type of action, say a user command, to basically request that module to begin loading. So that's the Prism module. And again, let's go back to our diagram. That's this thing that we're talking about here. So we're defining with this Prism Manager in the module catalog this sort of the instructions on how to and when to actually load this module. And again, in our diagram, we actually we don't have this one, so I'll just do this just so it's not so confusing. I mean, ideally you would have two, but we just don't. So we'll just kind of take that out of the equation for a second, and we'll just maybe put some transparency behind that, so that we know it's there, but it's just not there, kind of thing. How's that? Okay. So so what's happening is that we're really only defining one of these that's coming through, and we're saying when available, which means pretty much right away. As soon as the application is ready, is loaded up, and the client's loaded up, and the LightSwitch application's loaded up, and the provider's loaded, this is going to automatically download this Prism module. And once that does, this Prism module, as we saw earlier, is going to instruct Localization Manager that, hey, there's these two external resource files out there. One of them we want you to go and get right away, which is the French one, and the other one we want you to get at some later point. And basically that later point is when the user navigates this drop-down to pick this particular module. So basically, when these load in, when this loads in, those two load instructions go into Localization Manager, and they become set in stone inside this view model. And binding to this particular drop-down changes the selected item, allows this to come back up. And if it hasn't already loaded the resource, which it won't be in the case of the Spanish, it will automatically go and load that. So that's basically how it's all going to work. All right, there's a lot more to this, and we're running a little long here, so I just wanted to cover a few more things before we cut it out. So one of the things that you may recall if you've done any work with DockShell is that we have this concept of navigation containers, and our navigation container, if we go up to here, look at it from this perspective, is basically this these green blocks that you see here. And so out of the box, normally we default to the default navigation container. And a default navigation container will have things like where the data commands are, the command group. It'll be labeled, hardwired with the word data, and screens with the word function. But what we wanted to do was we want to be able to translate those. And so to translate those, we basically what we've done is we've created a custom navigation container. And if we so basically we copied it from our provider project. We'll just open this up just to show you. Okay, let's just open this and close, go down a little bit. All right, so in our standard default navigation container, which is basically no secret here. This is just a ribbon tab. That's all the control is. But if you scroll across, what we're doing here is we're actually binding to that resource manager. So in fact, what we're doing is we're binding the data region to the resource managers.region header data. If we go back to our resource file, you'll notice here that we actually have this header data file. So that's just basically what we're illustrating here is a binding that's happening directly to the resource manager. So if you've got other controls, this is one technique that you can use to basically bind and have your various cultures separated. Okay, so that's that we wanted to show you. And I think that's just about all that we wanted to cover off here. And so let's just run the application and see what happens. All right, so kind of expected because we have a little bit of a bug, but when I pull this list down here, you'll notice that there's no name in here. The display name is not set. And that's something that's just related to a bit of a refresh issue at startup. This is really the US English, so French and Spanish. So these names actually came as a result of, if we go back to our diagram, as a result of this module loading. So if that module didn't load, those names would not actually have appeared. So this is the display name, and in fact, if I'll show you by looking at the actual code where that is, that's in this module here. So what we're looking at there is this display name and this display name. So these two localization module definitions are being issued into the localization manager through this load resource files. Is really setting these up, and so what we're doing is we're seeing this combo box being bound to this this display name. Now, what's not shown here is that we automatically throw a default version of that in there for the culture that's the default culture that's running, basically. In this case, it's US English. And unfortunately, that display name, it is there. It's just unfortunately not binding properly to this dropdown. So it kind of takes a little bit away from the demo, but that's okay. But what's most important here is that you'll notice that when I switch, the UI changes. Now, not all of the UI do we have actually bound to the properties just yet. But for example, if I open up this particular file, you'll notice here that the buttons have all been translated. So if we go back to our model, when we're looking over here, for example, so this particular button here is actually being derived through this design string resource. That string resource is actually in this resource file, which is that resource layout file, and it is that text there. And also select this to design this screen. So that's the English, of course, and of course there's the equivalent French, and that's what we're seeing here when we go back to this guy here. And if I go over this and I can see the tooltip now, you can see that the tooltip has also been translated. But what's even more impressive, I think, is that you'll notice here that we actually have the language down below translated. So if I was to, for instance, go back to here. Now, of course, it doesn't refresh, so we have to refresh that. But when we refresh it, you'll notice that this text changes back to English, sort by, and page down below. And if I go back to French and do a refresh, you can see that it goes to the French equivalent of those words. And if I go to Spanish and do a refresh, now you can see that it's changing each one. So for instance, if I add a new customer, you can see that the screen is coming up with the appropriate Spanish title. And cancel. And if I was to go into design, you can see that it's in Spanish. To be careful because I don't have, I'm not very good at either Spanish or French, so I have to be very careful. So if we go into this one, you can see now the mode de personnalisation. There's my French. I apologize to any people that are French. So as you can see, what we have remaining here is that these are attributes that we need to bind. So we'll have those so that you can put those in your resource file. This is something that'll be in the resource file. This will be in the resource file, as will anything really, any English that we can see here that that needs to be translated will automatically be in the resource file. And you'll be able to um, basically add as many languages as you'd like. So that's basically localization in DockShell. And as you can see, we're pretty close. There's a couple of things that we got to work on here. One is this, you notice here that I am in French right now, but these particular resources are not being translated for some reason. So we have to figure out where they're situated and make sure that those are set appropriately. So there you go. Oh, and one other thing not mentioned here. None of this was translated, but the thing that we wanted to point out is that in most of the third-party control vendors, so currently we're only demonstrating Telerak, but most of them have a localization manager associated to them. So if you're using third-party controls that actually have a localization manager, you can simply take that resx file, that public one, and make that the resource manager for your third-party controls. So that allows you to, if you're using grids and stuff like that, where they have sort by and so forth, all of those words and phrases can be translated, and each I guess third-party control has a bunch of keys that you simply put those keys in and put the translated text in, and you'll be able to take advantage. And some of them actually have the actual assemblies, resource assemblies all done for you. So you'll be able to load those up simply by making references to them directly within your application. So I think that's just about all I wanted to cover today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this demonstration on localization within DockShell. And for more information, please visit our website at www.softlandingcanada.com. We also have a forum site at www.softlandingcanadaforums.com. Thank you and have a great day.